We're now going to have an open forum session run by Neil James from the Australia Defence Association. He has a number of questions from the previous session that he would like to ask to General Fox. Can I remind everybody to use Slido to give us your questions? I would ask you to put your cameras back on for the open forum and turn your cameras back on, and the questions will be read by Neil James. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for that, Paul. Look, we'll start with Peter Alkermade's question from the earlier session, which I suspect General Fox will answer first. Can the ADF recruit for entry to CERCAT 6 with a requirement to undertake essential pre-employment training as full-time training? This could address lateral recruitment of essential skills while enabling civil employment. Over to you, Natasha.
In simple terms, yes, we can. But the service need in relation to coming onto full-time service to undertake training in CERCAT 7 is what drives that initially. And then you can revert to CERCAT 6 on agreement with the service. So yes, we can facilitate CERCAT 6 recruitment, but there will be a period of initial employment training, recruit training, where you'll need to be CERCAT 7 because that is full-time training at this point in time. That's not to say that won't be adjusted in the future though.
Would any of the other panellists like to contribute anything? Moving on to the second question then, from Ben Cottrell. Within second division, becoming an independent command with more complex and diverse tasks. Hang on, you've lost it. You've taken it down again. We'll go to Peter Alkermade's.
I've got the question from Ben. It's just about whether there'll be increased full-time effect in the Division C2, and the answer is yes. And that will, some of that will take effect with the posting cycle for next year. So we will see an increase in full-time effect in the headquarters as we move towards a functional command. But what I would say about the C2 of the second division is we continue to want to leverage the total workforce system to generate effects. So it's not just about increasing the spine of full-time effect, it's also leveraging off those CERCAT 3 to 5 that give us that capability.
Thank you for that. We'll go to Peter Alkermade's second question then, probably for Natasha too. Given that CERCAT 7 and 5 have the same employment standards, is there a reason CERCAT 5 personnel can only apply for CERCAT 6 if on continuous full-time service?
Thanks. That's just a technical piece because you need to be doing in that CERCAT 6 and 7 permanent service construct in order to move on to CERCAT 6. So the logic is you apply to be permanent service and then CERCAT 6 is part of that from CERCAT 5. So it's just a technical point.
We'll move on then to Ben Dolroy's question. Given the shortened warning time, greater demands on defence and increased tendency to call out of reserve members, is it sustainable to have a ratio of 37,000 odd full-time versus 19,000 part-time or reserve members in the Army Objective Force? Probably one for you, Ian.
Thank you. Look, I wouldn't fixate on the numbers. I would argue that it's the total workforce that is the future force requirement. I think, you know, and to be fair, Ben, I wouldn't use the word tendency either. I'd say requirement. So there is no doubt that concurrency is a real issue inside the Army and across the Defence Force. And so our future force structures need to be agile enough to generate tempo. So there will be a requirement, I would say, at this point, for a period unspecified to maintain our domestic security requirements and have short notice contingency forces for both onshore and offshore operational threats and eventualities. So the issue now is and. We need a full-time force and we need a part-time force that is able to respond based on its readiness notice. So in that context, and with the planned recapitalisation, and particularly where a lot of the skills sit inside different parts of the force, if we have a humanitarian assistance disaster relief mission, for example, in the Southwest Pacific, And for whatever reason, the medical first response aspects of that is the priority, then we know that most of the specialists, in fact, nearly all the specialists, will come out of those health units that are predominantly part-time. And that's a good thing, because it means that we can access our entire workforce to be skill specific in a way that meets our readiness requirements. So it's not a pairwise. You don't take some out of the full-time in order to generate some for the part-time. It's that total workforce. And indeed, I think even the notion full-time, part-time is becoming a little bit out of date, because it is about service category. So the Army wants to be agnostic in the context of the value from CERCAT to CERCAT. This is all about capability and getting personnel and organisationally that part of the AOF right, so that we can get skills on readiness notice to call out whenever we need them. Thanks.
So Neil, I just want to add to that in terms of the joint and future force planning system. We no longer do force structure planning every 10 years. There is actually a cycle where we do it in an agile way at the strategic level, then in a tailored way for some specific categories. And then every 4 years, we have a fundamental review of our force structure based on emerging threats and circumstances that are assessed to design. So it's not just a set and forget force anymore right across the joint. Ian's point in and around the nature and preparedness and readiness of our forces, that's why we also have CERCAT 4, so some high readiness personnel. We have 34 CERCAT 4s across Defence at the moment, and the majority of those are, as Ian indicated, focused on our medical specialists and in predominantly aeromedical evacuation teams, where we need to move them at short notice.
Thank you for that. I don't know whether either of you have seen it, but about 2 days ago, a very clever young lieutenant had something on the Cove website relating to the fact how the ADF's use of full-time and part-time and the civil economy's use of part-time and casual was somewhat confusing and needed to be looked at in terms of the Fair Work Act. I don't know whether you've read the article, but it's certainly worth seeing, worth reading. The next question is, given increased utilisation of the ADF across services and total workforce for greater involvement in DAC and HODR roles, with some skills currency relying heavily on a reservist element to provide, is there any planned separation between historic and evolving roles or CERCAT utilisation? Have a think, Natasha. It's a rather wordy question.
I might jump in there, Neil, only in the sense that under the training model that we look for through the part-time recruit course, we're looking at off-ramps to allow opportunities for people to come out at different points and then rejoin the training system. So an example would be where we might categorise someone as a domestic support operator with a certain core group of skills achieved after partial completion of the part-time recruit course, and then going on further and continuing their training. But that would allow that group of people who could come out after 3 weeks of training and then be immediately employable in a domestic support operation, but wouldn't be employable in that foundation warfighting or a DFAC A task, because they would need to continue on with their training, including completion of the part-time recruit course and also their IET training. So there is a lot of work being done on trying to provide avenues for people to come into the organisation, complete training, and then modulise that over time.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Natasha.
Just add to that, Neil. Each of the services do this slightly differently. Navy, and I know you've got Commodore Buckley after the break, Navy are looking at a general mariner trade to do exactly what Dave has mentioned, is get a specific skill that Navy can utilise in a more generic sense rather than a specialist skill, so access talent and employ them earlier. Air Force also use, more so than the other services, the specialist service officer role, where they identify specific talent in industry and bring them in. They don't necessarily do a recruit course, for example, and are employed in a specialist role where they need to have some basic military training and are employed in a reserve construct. And indeed, I have a specialist service officer work for me, Air Commodore Robert Brown, in terms of specialist financial and consumer advice for our military people. So we do have a number of systems and approaches we can leverage. It's not necessarily a one size fits all for every service.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got a question. I'm going to fire at Ian Langford. There's been a lot of criticism coming out of ASPI, the think tanks, and in the press lately about the Army not being configured right for future warfare. Your presentation amply described that they are looking at all the things they're being accused of not looking at. But what's Army actually doing to counteract all this idiot criticism that's coming out of the think tanks and the press?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Look, it's a constant struggle to be able to develop a narrative that can, argue in an agile way relative to our requirement to, be based on logic, purpose, and truth. So, I mean, I would encourage, and we in the Army do a lot of engagement with think tanks and with academics, and our efforts to explain in an appropriate way, of course, our future capability is always on offer. So there is always a requirement for us to engage with all sorts of the community to explain how we're recapitalising. Some of the old chestnuts around tank this, APC this, heavy that, frankly, just aren't worth responding to, because if logic and purpose were a co-equal, then you would be able to, obviously engage and do so with proper conviction. But what is clear in terms of our strategic documents and, the published public remarks of the CDF and the Chief of Army and others is that we have a plan. It is available for anyone to be able to study closely and offer ways as to how to improve it. And then the other piece, which would be very useful, is to talk about the land domain in the joint context. So, we can sit here, and it's a learned audience here today that intuitively understands, the nature of war enduring, its characters constantly changing, combat power means this, and fighting power means that. And of course, it all makes absolute sense. The challenge is to translate that into a public discourse where we can assert our view, have conviction in doing it, and we do through our strategic documents, and then recognise some debates just aren't worth having. But it is a constant requirement in terms of being able to engage the zeitgeist, explain ourselves, and then act with conviction. And pleasingly, I'm confident in telling you and your audience that in terms of the objective force, it reflects government direction. This is not Army making it up. This is government telling Army as part of the Joint Force to execute its transformation plan. And what informs that are lessons and observations and military science that we know will be part of future warfare, but also that we're learning based on conflicts that we have been involved in, but also as equally those that we have not. So you've seen some of the use of improvised technologies and emerging threat vectors in recent conflicts between Azerbaijan and others, as well as what we've learned out of the Middle East in terms of the innovation cycle from non-state actors such as ISIS. So we need to continue to encourage the debate, participate willfully and with conviction, but we have high confidence that we have a plan that is fit for purpose, and we need to keep executing it. But the whole tank thing, for example, that has become a bit of a life-sucking exercise. We just need to continue to prosecute what's right. That's it.
Thank you for that, Ian. As a former director of the Land Warfare Studies Centre, I feel for you. The next question's for Natasha. The total workforce system and the employer support payment scheme. Is the funding for the employer support payment scheme still service-based? This can be they keep moving the question on me. This can be a barrier to accepting serve-up-C positions, as within Navy we are told that not all ESPS claims can be paid due to a limited budget, and that some serve-up-C requests will be denied as a result.
Thanks. That sounds quite a Navy-specific question, but I understand Brigadier Longley's on the panel after the break and has the responsibility for the employer support payment scheme, along with its various service DG purses, and I think they'll be better positioned to answer that question. But it sounds quite Navy specific, so Matt Buckley should take that.
Buck, well passed. Next question. Are there any silver bullets as to how we can make a step change in employer support for reserve service? And I add here, noting that Defence foolishly abolished the Defence Reserve Support Council last year.
I'll go first. It's a constant communications in and around the success of our reservists, and this is where the DRA is actually quite helpful. The more we can demonstrate the great skills that people have by undertaking reserve service, how their employer or their skills from their civilian employment can be utilised or otherwise in the ADF, and how ADF gives them additional skills, that makes them a great shared talent for the employer and the ADF. Sometimes we're not very good at telling that story, and that's not necessarily a step change. We've just got to be consistent about that to make sure that that story is told more frequently, and singing the praises of the great young people and older people that undertake reserve service. Neil, you also had a couple other questions for me in terms of recruiting. I'll wait till this question is finished and then be prepared for those.
Yeah, the question that came up this morning was essentially about the efficiency of contracting out recruiting, how that's going, but more importantly, if we had to scale up the force, how the civilian contractors would be able to do that efficiently, particularly in the case of reserve service. So have a think about that one, and we'll pass on to the next question to everyone. Are there any silver bullets as to how we could make a step change? Hang on, we've just done that one. The questions keep going off the screen for some reason. Hang on a sec. One general question then, and this is probably again for Ian, but to an extent for David. If we had to suddenly scale up the force substantially, swiftly and equitably, is anyone doing any contingency planning on whether a few years down the track or a decade down the track we might have to reintroduce conscription?
Yeah, I mean, there's plans in the department. I'd be very wary though in how I describe those plans. They don't arrive at an endpoint that means subscription. So scaling in terms of the mechanisms by which Defence in its current state might be able to increase its capacity comes in all forms. One of the rate determining factors will be defence industry. So how do we get our service delivery groups ready to do more quickly? How do we get our training system, which at times is up to 20% of our workforce, ready to do double the throughput? So getting our people or getting our citizenry ready for service in an all-volunteer way in the first instance, if it were to double our numbers as they are right now, would create stress across the system that would need to be treated before we increase our headline figure in any way. So our training system, our capability delivery system, our estate and infrastructure systems, all those aspects of being able to mobilise, to use that term, and again, Neil, I know you know this, it's a whole of government term, whole of nation term, but the scaling aspects of what Defence does, to answer the question, is part of how we calculate what we might need to do going forward. So it's very much part of certainly Defence leadership's thinking, but without oversimplifying my response, it's not just 2 RTB and off you go, and you're not suggesting that. This is a end-to-end review in terms of how to increase capacity quickly overall at a time when everything will be under pressure. It won't just be Defence that will need skilled people in the context of a national emergency, for example. That's it.
Thank you for that, Ian. If I could go back to Natasha for the question on civil contracting of recruiting.
Sure. So prior to 1999, each of the services did their own recruiting. In those individual service recruiting periods of time, the data suggests that the services only achieved 60 to 70% of target achievement when the individual service were undertaking recruiting. Over the last 5 to 10 years, we've achieved in terms of target recruiting, and a growing number of targets each year, anywhere between 85 and 94% of target achievement. And indeed, this just this financial year gone, over 7,000 young Australians joined the Australian Defence Force in a pandemic. And the recruiting system pivoted such that not one of those people recruited actually had COVID and therefore transmitted COVID in a force protection sense into our workforce. So that was a combined effort of young people recruiting. Now, I just want to also put an end to another myth. We actually have an integrated workforce when we do recruiting. The current incumbents, Manpower Group, who is a recruiting processing outsourcing company, so an expert recruiting company. And we have a military workforce that exists and does the defence interviewer work as well with the recruiting company. So it is an integrated endeavour. And like I said, over 7,000 people joined the ADF last year in a pandemic. We have year-on-year growing targets. We're up to around 8,000 targets this year to join the ADF, and that is around 86,000 applications we need. It's a 10-to-1 conversion rate in general terms for across the 3 services to join. So the services couldn't go back to individual services conducting a recruiting effort themselves. It just that the efficiencies would not be there. People don't realise as well, the big campaigns that you see perhaps in movie theatres, sometimes in TVs and in different ads, they are actually set and approved by government through the Service Delivery Committee of Cabinet. So we also work inside the government approval machinery to do all of this recruiting effort in terms of attraction, recruitment, enlistment, etc. Across Australia. In terms of, we're in severe competition right now in terms of the Australian market. Ian mentioned before the lack of around 75,000 skilled migration into Australia, and every industry is competing for talent at the moment. So every effort is made in and around that recruiting piece, including the government has just approved recruiting to go back into YouTube. We were banned from YouTube for quite a substantial period of time for brand safety reasons. For those who don't know, youth of today are not on TV, parents might be, but youth of today are actually engaged in YouTube. So that's where we need to be. Our ads are not designed to recruit the people that are currently in the ADF, they're designed to join us to the ADF. And then our great young people who are in Defence Force recruiting, or in Army's case, we leverage junior mentors right across the ADF about in particular trades. They're the great people that then sell the role to young people wanting to join. So it's a systems effort to recruit into the Australian Defence Force, and it will be a growing effort. Right now, we are in tender for a new recruiting services contract. It was announced that there are 4 candidates that have been taken through to the next stage and are currently in solution definition arrangements. The tenders are due to be submitted by February next year, and we will be in a new contract as of July 2023. That new contract is all designed for agility and volume in our recruiting system. So we are working in terms of what we need to do to position for future, should that be required to surge with a new recruiting services contract. The 4 companies, I can talk to that, that's public. It's Manpower Group, but under Talent Solutions is the name. Adecco, and they are the recruiting processing outsourcing companies that's in their DNA. Accenture and Toll have also been successful to go through to the next stage. That's all I can say at this point for probity reasons, but in July 23, we'll be in a new contract.
Okay, just 2 quick follow-up questions. In terms of agility and volume, how will they cope with a need to substantially increase the force swiftly? And secondly, the figures have improved for recruitment. Are they across the board or only for the full-time force? And what are the figures for the reserve force?
In terms of that last question, I'll answer that first. That's in total. When I measure recruitment targets, I measure it total. In some instances, or over some years, Army in the reserve force, the biggest ab initio recruiter, and that's why I'll talk Army, it wasn't good at all. And it wasn't good historically either. So last year, I think we're upwards of 85% of particular targets. Now that has to be balanced as well in the ability to train, and that's what Ian said, part of our training system. We might set targets, but the reality of our training system isn't necessarily set to cope with bulk numbers as well. So we've got to do a systems approach to volume, not just get the numbers approach. And we have to obviously be more agile when I talk about recruit. So we've got a very lean system, as it should be when I talk about we recruit people and we link them to training courses so that there's no downtime in training to get qualifications, so we can get people skilled as quickly as possible. Sometimes we just need to recruit when ready and accept that there might be delays and people can get other skills in that time. But again, that's stress on a training system that's industrialized. It's set for industrial training or industrial strength training in terms of the volume. So how we scale is really important in due course. Now, so that answered your second question first. Now go back to the first element, Neil.
The first one was, what would the ability be of the commercial contractors in terms of agility and volume to scale up quickly and substantially if they had to?
I think they could do it. They could do it quicker than what a purist military model could, because it all comes down to we pay for what we want to obtain in terms of value for money. And if we want to pay for volume and speed, that can achieve. But I just go back to the point around the recruiting system. The actual contractors do the front of house processing work. Our military people do the selection. Selections are on the basis of the standards set by the services. So we don't take risk in that sense. And it's about when we're going into this new recruiting services contract, it's about the entirety of the recruiting system, not a contract to just deliver marketing and attraction and some processing aspects. We've got to look at the systems approach to it.
Thank you very much for a thorough answer.
Thank you, Neil. And can I just thank our speakers for a very informed and articulate presentations. The Commander of the 2nd Division, General Tomei, we wish you all the success in your appointment. I'd like to particularly thank General Fox, who's come to our conferences for the last 3 years, and I wish her all the best in her next appointment as the Deputy Chief of Army. In fact, the first female that's been a Deputy Chief of Army, so we wish you well. And also to Brigadier Langford for your very professional and informative presentation. Can I just remind all the people listening to this seminar that the total workforce system was in fact a reserve initiative, and while it's been taken on board and in my view become more complex than it needs to be, nevertheless I think it raises the issue of whether or not we need to continue to refer to our reservists as actually reservists, or whether we just talk to them as full-time members or part-time members of the particular service.